When defenders of the faith realize they have no valid or reasonable argument, they try to end discussion with an escape excuse, where they say that atheists secretly know that there really is a God, but we pretend there isn't one because we love sin. I must have heard this nonsense 100 times, but every part of that claim is wrong. First of all, it implies that even things we don't believe are still beliefs, as if not believing that something is true or exists means believing it's false or does not exist. The context here is that whether you believe or not is still an act of faith either way, as if no one was ever convinced by the facts, even of things they didn't want to know, but are honest enough to accept. That's what reasonable people do, and that's why they say that the truth hurts and is inconvenient and that the facts are cold and hard. The truth may set you free, but first it might piss you off. And likewise, it is never wise to believe anything claimed by another without question, without reservation, or without reason. Having no reason to believe something is a pretty good reason not to believe it, and being thus unconvinced is precisely what it means to have no faith at all. Not doing something is the default position over doing anything, including existing. You can have positive and negative feelings about something, like giving a thumbs up or thumbs down on YouTube, but if you don't like a Facebook post, it doesn't mean you clicked dislike. That's not even an option, because it doesn't need to be. If you didn't like it, you didn't like it. Same goes for belief. If I don't convince you, then you won't believe me. It doesn't mean that you necessarily believe I'm wrong. You could withhold judgment on that, which means you still wouldn't believe me until or unless I convince you to make up your mind. In this sense, belief is a conviction, and a lack of belief is a lack of conviction. And if you don't know whether it's true or not, then you were obviously not convinced. You don't believe. And most atheists are in this category, and I was too for much of my life. However, I realize now that I can honestly say that I know there is no God. And no one knows there is a God. Belief does not equal knowledge. And while it is not always possible to prove a negative, or disprove a negative, whichever that is, I know that there is no God in the same way and to the same degree that I know there are no leprechauns. It's not just that there's no evidence of them, but also because it is impossible for such things to exist. It is physically impossible to simply wish things into existence. It is logically impossible for something in the image of an evolved ape to exist prior to the evolution of apes, and it is definitively impossible for a disembodied mind to exist absent the brain that created it, because that's what a mind is, the knowledge, notions, and memories produced by a brain. If God exists outside our reality, then he does not exist in reality. If God is beyond time, then at no time does God exist. And before we can know whether something is possible, we must have some precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon indicating that possibility. If we can't show that such possibility exists, then we can't honestly say that it does, because it evidently doesn't, and neither does God. Next is the notion of sin. What is that? As some people think that anything that feels good or tastes good is sin, but somehow unnecessarily excessive violence is not always. Depends on who you ask, because every believer seems to have a different idea, and every religion contradicts all the others, even though they all claim to have the same objective source. We'll talk more about that in another video. For the moment, remember that in Abrahamic religions, divorce is strictly forbidden, except when it's okay, and murder is forbidden too, except that you're supposed to kill people who are working on weekends. Because Friday through Saturday and Sunday are all Sabbath to somebody, all according to the same God who reportedly says that virtually every sin is punishable by death, and you're obliged to do that yourself. Sin is supposed to be breaking the laws of God, and everybody does that except those who realize that there are no laws given by God, because there is no God, and his laws would be unenforceable, unjust, and indefensibly insane anyway. We have to obey the laws of men instead, and we atheists do a much better job of that than believers do. Statistically, there is a negative correlation between religiosity and moral behavior. And now that the irreligious nuns account for 1/4 of the U.S. population, we are still, for whatever reason, remarkably underrepresented in the prison population. The factions of dominant religions statistically have the highest crime rate, with special emphasis on hate crimes. Instead of turning the other cheek and forgiving those who trespass against us, religious people are more likely to condone the killing or torture of prisoners, where non-religious people are more likely to consider that morally wrong. Now, being atheist doesn't make you a good person, but it doesn't make you a bad person either, just like belief in God obviously doesn't make anyone good, nor does it necessarily make you evil. But embracing either religious or political ideologies can grossly distort your morality. The most religious countries tend to have the highest murder rates, and the same is true of the most religious areas of the United States. The higher the religiosity in a given populace, the higher the rates of violent crime. Nations that are more secular show the opposite tendency, where the less religious they are, the more peaceful they tend to be. Here in the United States, evangelical Christians have the highest divorce rate. They also have the highest rates of teen pregnancy, especially in areas where they taught abstinence only instead of offering sex education. Students in private schools where evolution is not taught are statistically more likely to get an abortion than their peers in public schools where evolution is taught. This is an indictment of religious hypocrisy, and it shows what a colossal failure the policies of the religious right have always been. But it gets even worse than that. Child Protective Services and other agencies report that a significant majority of child abusers and molesters identify as very religious. And the more religious they are, the worse offenders they are, with worse offenses against more and younger victims. Yet, religious people argue that the less religious we are, the less moral we are, which is obviously false, just like everything else they believe. These people think that their God mandates morality, that he judges people by how good or bad they are? If that were true, then the Bible would offer some provision wherein atheists could get into heaven if they're good and kind and charitable, as many of them are. But that's not what the Bible says. It says it doesn't matter how evil you are. All sins will be forgiven if you but believe. But if you don't believe, then it doesn't matter how good you are, because the only sin that will not be forgiven is the sin of disbelief. Your good works are like filthy rags, and you're supposed to believe all this on faith, which means there's no reason to believe it at all. You swallow what you're told just because you're told to, and you dare not question the reason why. Thus, gullibility is the sole criteria for redemption. Then there's the notion that God will just go away if you ignore him, meaning that even believers seem to accept that if you don't believe in God, then he doesn't exist. But if he really did exist, then we're smart enough to realize that we can't just wish him away. And we know that nothing pisses him off more than when people don't believe in him. That's the one thing that guarantees that you'll go to hell. It's also another indication that this is just a game of pretend. But it wouldn't make any sense to pretend he's not real if he really is. So if you love your sin, then accept Jesus as your imaginary friend and keep on doing what you're doing, because he'll forgive you as long as you make believe that he will. But if you can't pretend that things are true when you know they couldn't possibly be, and you say, as I do, that there is no God, you'd better be damned sure of that. And I am, because I have good reason to be.